Chapter 1. The Battlefield. The vast expanse of space stretched infinitely before Captain Jackson Calloway, the stars twinkling like distant fires burning in the cold void. His ship, the Stalwart, a battered but reliable war cruiser, hummed steadily as it drifted through the silence of the Riylo system. The usual humdrum of his crew's daily routine was replaced by a sense of anticipation, a quiet tension hanging in the air as they neared the battle zone. Jackson stared out the viewport, his sharp eyes narrowing as the planet Riylo came into view. The once thriving industrial world now appeared as a scar on the face of the galaxy, a place stripped of life and resources, its atmosphere choked with the smog of war. The Varkari, the ruthless alien invaders who had descended upon Riylo like a plague, were still entrenched in the planet's capital, their forces overwhelming and unyielding. Jackson was no stranger to conflict. He had fought in countless skirmishes, each one more brutal than the last. But this was different. The battle for Riylo had been dragging on for weeks, with the Varkari showing no signs of retreat. They had overrun most of the planet, taking control of the key mining facilities that provided the vital resources the Galactic Federation needed to fuel its war machine. The Federation had responded with everything they had, sending reinforcements to retake the planet. But even with the might of the human fleet behind them, the tide of war had yet to turn in their favor. Jackson's hand rested on the cool metal of the control console as he thought back to the first time he had seen the planet from orbit. Riylo had been a beacon of prosperity, a hub of trade and industry, its cities sprawling across the surface like veins in a living organism. Now, it was a war zone. The once vibrant cities were now just silhouettes against the smoke-filled sky, their skyscrapers broken and crumbling, their streets littered with the remnants of human and alien soldiers alike. The Varkari's relentless assault had left little in its wake but destruction and death, and Jackson had been in the thick of it, leading his men into battle, fighting to retake the world and restore some semblance of peace. The battle had not been kind to him. Jackson's body bore the scars of countless conflicts, the most recent being a deep gash along his arm that had nearly severed the muscle. His face was weathered, hardened by years of fighting, but his eyes still burned with the same intensity as they had when he first joined the Federation Army. He was a soldier through and through, trained to fight, to lead, to protect. It was all he had ever known. The loss of life, the bloodshed, it was the cost of war, and Jackson had long since accepted that it was the price of freedom. But as he stared at Riylo, he felt the familiar pang of guilt. Was this the price they were willing to pay for victory? Was it worth it? The death toll was mounting on both sides, and every victory felt hollow. Every time his men succeeded in reclaiming a small piece of the planet, it was paid for with the blood of soldiers and civilians alike. He wasn't sure how much longer he could endure it. "Captain," came the voice of Lieutenant Kara Ellison, his second in command, breaking through his reverie. Jackson turned to find her standing in the doorway of his command quarters, her face set in a hard expression. Kara was a seasoned officer, a woman of steel, unflinching in the face of danger, yet even she couldn't hide the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. "The fleet's ready. The attack on the capital begins in 2 hours." Jackson nodded without saying a word. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. The final push to retake Riylo. The last chance they had to wrest control from the Varkari. If they failed now, the planet would be lost for good. The Federation would lose one of its most valuable resources, and the enemy would be emboldened, their reign of terror spreading across the galaxy. "We need to win this, Kara," Jackson said quietly, his voice filled with a rare vulnerability. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. How much longer we can keep doing this." Kara's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a moment. "We do what we have to, sir. You know that." She stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've got this. We'll take back Riylo. We'll give them hell." Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words, but also feeling the cold steel of reality settle back into his chest. He was a soldier. He didn't have the luxury of doubt. There was no room for hesitation or fear. He had a mission, and that mission would be carried out, no matter the cost. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. The fleet was in position, the strategy was set, and the soldiers were ready. Jackson's mind ran through the battle plan again and again, ensuring every detail was accounted for. The Varkari's defenses would be formidable, but he knew their weaknesses. They had weaknesses. Every army did, and they would exploit them. The operation would begin with a full orbital strike, followed by a ground assault to reclaim the capital. It was a risky move, but Jackson had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He wasn't about to let the Varkari win, not after everything they had taken from the Federation, from the people of Riylo. As the fleet moved into position, Jackson found himself at the front of the line, commanding his men with a quiet intensity. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying fire that burned in his words, something that drove his soldiers to follow him into the fire. He had earned their respect, their loyalty, through countless battles, and they would follow him to the ends of the galaxy if he asked it of them. They were more than just soldiers. They were his family, bound by the blood they had spilled together, the struggles they had faced side by side. And when the signal came to launch the attack, when the first bombs began to fall, Jackson felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that always accompanied battle. The fight was on. The Varkari wouldn't know what hit them. The battle for Riylo was a brutal, chaotic mess. Explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet. The skies were filled with the roar of fighter ships, and the ground shook with the sound of gunfire and combat. Jackson's unit was at the forefront of the fighting, cutting their way through the Varkari's lines with ruthless efficiency. His soldiers were like machines, cold, calculating, and precise. They were warriors, every one of them, trained to fight and survive. And they fought with a ferocity born of necessity. But despite the ferocity of their assault, the Varkari were relentless. Their alien technology, their advanced weaponry, and their sheer numbers made them a formidable enemy. It felt as though every inch of ground gained was paid for in blood. And as the battle raged on, Jackson began to feel the crushing weight of it all. His men were dying. The casualties were mounting, and with each loss, his resolve was tested. Amid the chaos, Jackson received an unexpected message, a direct communication from High Command. He listened intently, his heart racing as the voice on the other end relayed the news. The Federation had decided to reward him for his efforts. The reward was unexpected, almost absurd in its implications. Captain Calloway, your efforts have been exemplary, the voice from High Command said. You are being granted an extraordinary honor. As a token of appreciation for your services, you have been given the right to claim a prize. The Varkari have offered an alien slave to the victor of this war. She is yours to command. We trust you will see fit to use this reward to your advantage. The transmission ended before Jackson could fully process the words. A slave. An alien woman. He hadn't known the Federation had made such deals with the Varkari, let alone that they were using such rewards to encourage military victories. The implications were staggering, but Jackson didn't have time to dwell on them. The war was far from over, and the battle for Riylo raged on. Jackson sat in stunned silence, the message from High Command echoing in his mind. A slave. He had heard of such practices in distant parts of the galaxy, of powerful warriors claiming prisoners as rewards after great battles. But to have it offered to him, as though it were some kind of prize to be claimed, made his stomach churn. The very idea of owning another sentient being, a woman no less, felt wrong. Yet, there was no mistaking it. The order had come directly from the top. The Federation had sanctioned it. His reward. His thoughts were interrupted by the deafening roar of an incoming blast. The ground shook beneath him, and alarms blared throughout the stalwart as the bridge crew scrambled to maintain control of the ship. Jackson snapped back into battle mode, his instincts kicking in as he adjusted his seat and keyed in commands for his team. The Varkari forces had launched a counterattack, and the battle was far from over. Captain Calloway. Kara Ellison's voice cut through the chaos, and Jackson glanced at his second-in-command. Her face was a mask of focus, but he could see the strain in her eyes. We've lost communications with the front line. The enemy is pushing back hard. We need reinforcements, or we risk losing the capital entirely. Jackson's mind flashed back to the message he had just received, and the gnawing unease settled back into his gut. He pushed the thought aside. There was no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. His soldiers were out there, fighting, dying, and he would be damned if he let them lose because of his indecision. We'll hold our position, Jackson replied, his voice steel. Send the signal to the rest of the fleet. Reinforcements will arrive, But we need to keep them off the capital until then. Understood, sir, Kara said, her tone sharp. She quickly relayed the orders, and Jackson's focus returned to the battle. The battle for Riylo was unlike any Jackson had fought before. The Valkyrie were relentless, their tactics precise, and they fought with a ferocity that mirrored his own soldiers' determination. For every inch of ground they gained, they lost more than a dozen men. It wasn't just a fight for resources, it was a fight for survival. The Federation had to reclaim Riylo, not just for its strategic value, but because every world they lost to the Valkyrie was another step closer to galactic annihilation. The hours dragged on, the battle relentless, as Jackson moved between the front lines and the command center, ensuring his men had everything they needed to push forward. But every victory felt hollow. Every inch gained in the battle was another reminder of the price they were paying. The war seemed endless, and no matter how hard they fought, the Valkyrie were always there, just a step ahead. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the Federation's forces made their final push into the heart of the capital. Jackson stood at the command center, watching as his soldiers flooded the streets, their guns blazing as they fought their way into the Valkyrie stronghold. The resistance was fierce, but the tide had turned in their favor. The battle was almost won. That was when he received another transmission, this time from General Roland Hawk, his commanding officer. "Captain," the general's voice crackled through the comms, his tone clipped. "The Federation has received the final terms from the Valkyrie. They've agreed to surrender the planet in exchange for peace. However, there is one condition dash." Jackson's gut tightened. "What condition?" "The slave," General Hawk continued. "The Valkyrie have agreed to release a woman of their race, one who was captured during the conflict. She is to be handed over to you as a symbol of victory. High Command insists it is a reward, and it's your decision how to handle her." Jackson's blood ran cold. "The woman, the alien slave." "Understood," Jackson replied, his voice flat. "I'll handle it." "Good," the general said. "The peace talks will begin in the coming days." "You've done well, Captain. Rest is earned." As the transmission ended, Jackson stood there for a moment, his mind spinning. He had led his men to victory, and for that, he had been rewarded with something he had never asked for. An alien woman, a slave, as a symbol of his success. He couldn't fathom how he would ever reconcile that in his mind. But there was no turning back now. The peace talks were imminent, and the Federation had set its terms. He would have to face the consequences of his reward, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 2. The Reward. The following day, after the last remnants of the Valkyrie forces had been pushed off the planet's surface, Jackson stood at the entrance to his quarters, waiting for the designated messenger to arrive. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had won the battle. He had secured a victory for the Federation. But now, he was about to be confronted with a prize he didn't want. He had never imagined that the cost of winning would come in the form of an alien woman, one who would be forced into his service, a reminder of the Federation's imperialistic reach. When the knock finally came at his door, Jackson took a steadying breath before answering. Standing before him was a Federation officer, holding a metallic collar and a small data pad in his hands. "Captain Calloway," the officer said, his voice respectful yet detached. "The prisoner has been brought to your quarters as per High Command's orders. She is yours to command." Jackson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Send her in." The officer stepped aside, and behind him stood a woman unlike any Jackson had ever seen. She was tall, much taller than any human woman he had encountered, and her features were sharp, almost ethereal. Her skin was a pale shade of violet, with dark, intricate markings running along her arms and across her neck, glowing faintly in the dim light. Her long, silvery hair fell to her waist, and her eyes, bright yellow, like twin suns, stared at him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She was beautiful, in an alien, otherworldly way, but there was no mistaking the look of pain in her eyes. She stood there, her posture tense, as though she were expecting something. Her hands were bound in front of her, the metallic collar locked around her neck, a symbol of her status as a prisoner, a slave. Jackson's throat went dry, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something akin to discomfort. This woman, this alien, had been captured by the enemy and handed to him as a prize. She was a living reminder of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost. And now, she was his to command. "Your name?" Jackson asked, his voice low, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to ask. It seemed almost absurd. The woman looked at him with a mixture of defiance and submission, her voice soft yet firm. "My name is Kalira," she replied, her words carefully measured. "I am of the Ethrian people, and I was not born to be anyone's prize." Jackson took a step forward, his eyes searching hers, trying to find something beyond the sharpness, beyond the pain. But all he saw was the raw edge of a warrior who had been broken by the horrors of war. "Why are you here?" he asked, though the answer seemed self-evident. She was a prisoner, a slave, forced into his presence as part of his reward. Kalira met his gaze without flinching. "Because your victory is built on the suffering of others," she said, her voice tinged with a bitterness that sent a flicker of guilt through him. "You are the hero, the victor, and I am the consequence of that." Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but he found that he couldn't. The weight of her words settled over him like a shroud, and for the first time, he questioned everything he had done, everything he had fought for. Kalira stood in silence, waiting for him to speak, but Jackson remained silent. The reality of his reward had just hit him. What was he supposed to do with her? How could he live with this? Before he could formulate an answer, the officer stepped forward again, breaking the silence. "Captain, High Command insists that you make use of her. The Varkari have offered her as a token of their surrender. You are to decide what happens next." Jackson looked at Kalira again, her eyes unwavering, her gaze sharp and full of challenges. He was a soldier, a man of war, but now he was being forced to confront the deeper, darker consequences of that very war. "I don't know what you expect from me," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Kalira remained quiet for a long time, her eyes locked on his. "I expect nothing," she said finally. "I'm no slave, but I'll survive this, just as I survived everything else." Jackson's heart twisted at the words, and in that moment, he realized that this was not just a reward. This was a turning point, a moment where everything, his morality, his duty, his sense of self, was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The silence between them grew thick, oppressive, as Jackson stood across from Kalira. The weight of her words hung in the air, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. She was right. He was a soldier, and soldiers fought to win. They fought to take, to conquer, to control. But as he stared into her fierce, golden eyes, he began to question what he was really fighting for. She had been handed to him as a reward, a symbol of victory in a war he didn't entirely believe in anymore. And yet, her presence, the stark reality of her suffering, was forcing him to confront the true cost of that victory. He glanced over at the officer who had brought her to him, his face impassive, almost indifferent to the tension in the room. The officer held a data pad, ready to complete his report. "Captain, High Command expects you to take immediate action. You are required to put the prisoner Kalira to use as per the terms of the surrender." Jackson felt a surge of frustration rising within him. He had been trained for war, for battle, for strategy. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't a diplomat or a ruler. He was a soldier, and this was beyond anything he had ever been prepared for. He looked at Kalira again, and something in her expression softened. There was a hardness to her. Yes, a bitterness born from years of survival. But beneath that, there was a raw, untapped humanity that Jackson couldn't ignore. "I'm not going to use you," Jackson said, his voice low and uncertain, but resolute. "You're not a prize to be claimed. You're a person, and I won't treat you like a possession." Kalira's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes: surprise, maybe, or hope. She didn't say anything at first, but the silence between them spoke volumes. She was no slave, and she had made that clear from the moment she spoke. Her alien pride, her unyielding spirit, couldn't be broken so easily, no matter the chains placed upon her. The officer, sensing the tension in the room, cleared his throat, though he didn't dare challenge Jackson's authority directly. "High Command insists on this arrangement, Captain. You must do as ordered. It's a matter of strategy and diplomacy. She is a symbol, a living symbol of the Federation's strength." Jackson's hands clenched at his sides. He didn't want this. He didn't want her as a symbol of victory. He wanted peace, he wanted justice, and he wanted the war to end. But most of all, he wanted to make things right if such a thing was possible. I'm not doing this for them, Jackson muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned away from the officer and walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling, war-torn landscape of Riylo below. The skies were heavy with the remnants of smoke and ash, the signs of a planet devastated by years of conflict. His mind raced with thoughts of what he had just witnessed, the blood spilled, the families torn apart, the sacrifices made. He couldn't escape the feeling that, even if they won this war, they had already lost. I need time to think, Jackson said finally, his back still turned to the officer. His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. You can go now. The officer hesitated, but then he nodded stiffly, turning on his heel and leaving Jackson alone with Kalira. The door slid shut behind him, leaving only the two of them in the quiet of Jackson's quarters. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jackson turned back to face her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was standing there, as proud and defiant as ever, her eyes locked on his, waiting for him to make the next move. You don't have to stay here, Jackson said softly, his voice tinged with regret. You don't have to do what High Command wants. I can find a way to get you out of here. Kalira's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. You think I want to run? You think I want to be hidden away like some prize? I have fought for my freedom every day of my life, Captain. I don't need anyone's pity. But I won't forget that you're offering something different. Her voice was steady, but the weariness in it betrayed a depth of pain that Jackson could barely fathom. Your people, your Federation, they don't understand what they've taken from me. They think they can use me as a token. They think they can make me a symbol of their victory. She shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. You think I don't see through their lies? Jackson didn't know how to respond. He wasn't a man who was used to questioning orders, questioning the larger purpose of the war. He had always been a soldier, a warrior, and his duty was clear: follow orders and fight to the bitter end. But standing here, looking at Kalira, at the woman who had been forced into this situation, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his role in this war than just victory. He took a deep breath, his hand running through his dark hair in frustration. I'm sorry, he said quietly, looking at her again, this time with a new sense of understanding. I never asked for this, and I'm not going to make you my slave, no matter what High Command says. Kalira's gaze softened, and for the first time, she stepped toward him, the chain around her wrist clinking as she moved. You're different from the others, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. You don't belong in this war, but you are part of it, whether you like it or not. And so am I. Jackson didn't know what to say to that. The war had taken so much from both of them, and yet, somehow, here they were bound by circumstances beyond their control. He had been given an alien woman as a reward, a living prize, and yet all he could think of was the suffering she had endured. Where do we go from here? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kalira's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was no anger, no bitterness. There was just understanding. We fight, she said softly. We fight, because that is all we can do. Chapter 3. The Escape. The war was far from over, and Jackson knew that he couldn't just sit idly by while the Federation made decisions he couldn't live with. His mission had always been clear: protect the galaxy, protect his people, and ensure the survival of humanity. But Kalira had made him realize that survival wasn't just about winning battles. It was about understanding the cost of victory. In the days that followed, Jackson kept Kalira close, though not as a prisoner. She was free to come and go as she pleased within the ship, her presence slowly becoming an undeniable part of his life. The more he learned about her, the more he realized how little he understood about the galaxy he had been fighting to protect. Kalira was a living testament to the horrors of war, and her people, the Ethrians, were victims of a conflict that spanned millennia. The Varkari had destroyed her homeworld, wiped out her people, and now, the Federation wanted to use her as a tool in their grand design. But Jackson wasn't ready to let that happen. As much as his orders dictated one course of action, his conscience pointed him in another direction. He couldn't be complicit in the exploitation of another sentient being, no matter her origin. Kalira had suffered enough, and Jackson knew that there was more to this war than just military victories and political power. There was the fight for humanity, for justice, and for the kind of future he wanted to build. Over the next few days, Jackson made plans. He would leave the Federation behind. He would find a way to get Kalira to safety, away from the prying eyes of high command. They would escape, and they would fight together but not as enemies. Not as victors and prisoners. As allies. As something more. But escaping wasn't going to be easy. The Federation's reach was long, and the Valkyrie were not a force to be underestimated. Jackson had to act quickly, and his first step was to contact his old allies, the ones who had fought alongside him in the darkest days of the war. They owed him a debt, and he was about to call it in. The days that followed were tense, filled with constant movement as Jackson made preparations in secret. He had been a soldier all his life, accustomed to planning for conflict, but this was different. This wasn't a mission dictated by strategy or necessity, it was a deeply personal one, motivated by a moral compass he hadn't known he still possessed. He found himself sneaking glances at Kalira, now free to roam the corridors of the Stalwart, her presence increasingly felt in every corner of the ship. She wasn't just another alien prize, a symbol of war. She was an individual, a woman with her own past, her own battles, and a shared understanding that they both had something to fight for. But the Federation wasn't going to let Kalira slip away easily. They had claimed her as a spoil of war, and to release her or worse, help her escape was treason. Jackson knew the consequences. If the Federation found out about his plans, there would be no turning back. He would be branded a traitor, his military career shattered, and he would lose everything. But as the days passed, the weight of the situation grew heavier on his shoulders. Every conversation with Kalira revealed more of the truth, and with each revelation, his determination to help her escape solidified. She wasn't a tool of war to be used for political leverage, she was a person. And that meant something to him. The first step in his plan was contacting his old allies. These were soldiers he had fought with during the hardest campaigns of the warmen and women who owed him their lives. He hoped they still believed in the cause they had once fought for, not the one the Federation had turned into. It had been months since he'd spoken to them, but when the chips were down, he trusted them. They had to get Kalira off the Stalwart, and to do that, they would need the help of people on the outside, those who still operated outside the Federation's watchful eye. That evening, in the shadows of the ship's mess hall, Jackson met with his trusted contact, Lieutenant Rena Hawk. She had once been his mentor, a sharp strategist with a quick wit and a razor-sharp focus. Jackson had always admired her pragmatism, though he knew she wasn't one to break the rules easily. "Rena," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need your help. I've got a mission, but it's not one I can do alone." Rena looked at him, her piercing green eyes narrowing slightly. She was no stranger to danger, but Jackson could tell that she had questions. She always had questions. She folded her arms across her chest and leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice. "I thought you were done with the Black Ops, Jackson," she said. "You're in a very different league now. The Federation's watching every move you make. What are you really asking me to do?" "I'm asking for your trust," Jackson replied. "I've got someone who needs to disappear, someone who's not a prisoner, but has been treated like one. The Federation made a mistake by putting her in my charge, and I'm going to correct that mistake." Rena's eyes flicked toward the door, making sure no one was listening. "Who are we talking about?" she asked cautiously, her expression softening slightly, but still guarded. Jackson's heart beat faster. This was the moment. "Kalira," he said simply. There was a long pause. Rena's face betrayed no emotion, but her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "The Ethrian?" she asked, as though testing the waters. "I thought the Valkyrie wiped them out. She's been what? A war prize? Not a prize. A slave. But she's not a piece of property, Rena. She's a person, and I'm not going to let the Federation use her like that." Rena looked at him for a long time, her silence weighing heavily between them. Then, finally, she spoke. "If we do this, there's no going back. The Federation won't stop looking for her. They'll come after you, Jackson. They'll come after all of us." Jackson nodded, accepting the gravity of what he was asking. "I know, but I can't live with myself if I let her become just another casualty of this war." Rena stared at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but all she saw was unwavering determination. She sighed deeply and ran a hand through her short, dark hair. "All right, Calloway," she said finally, her voice low but resolute. "I'll help you, but you need to be ready for the fallout. I'm in this with you, but we're doing it my way." Jackson felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The clock was ticking, and every move they made had to be precise. As they discussed the details of their escape plan, Jackson's mind raced with the implications of their actions. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Chapter 4: The Final Stand. The days that followed were filled with meticulous planning and preparation. Jackson knew the Federation's fleet would be watching the stalwart closely. They had no idea that he was planning an escape for Kalira, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He worked quietly with Rena and a small group of loyal soldiers to prepare the transport ship they would use to get Kalira off the stalwart. They had a window, a narrow one, during the upcoming peace talks when the Federation would be distracted. That would be their only chance. The night before the planned escape, Jackson found himself back in his quarters, sitting in front of Kalira. She was sitting across from him, the chains around her wrists a constant reminder of the oppression she had suffered. He had told her of his plan, of the risks they would both be taking. And despite the danger, she had agreed. There was no turning back now. "We leave tomorrow," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady. "Rena and the others will get us through Federation space. Once we're out of their reach, we'll be safe." Kalira looked at him, her golden eyes softening slightly, though there was still the sharpness of someone who had seen too much. "And what then, Captain?" she asked, her voice tinged with something that might have been hope or skepticism. "Once we're free, what will you do?" Jackson thought about it for a moment. He had always been a soldier, defined by his mission, his orders. But now his purpose had shifted. "I'll fight for you," he said quietly. "I'll fight for what's right. I'll help you rebuild, if that's what you want. I'm not just going to let you disappear into the shadows, Kalira." Her gaze softened further, a fleeting expression of gratitude crossing her features. "And what will you do with me once we're free?" she asked, her voice a whisper now, as if afraid of the answer. Jackson looked into her eyes and saw the fear there, the fear of being abandoned again, of being nothing more than a tool, a prisoner. "I won't use you, Kalira," he said firmly. "You're not a prize. You're a person. You deserve to be free, to live the life you choose. I'm not going to keep you as a trophy." For a moment, Kalira said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "Thank you." The next day, everything went according to plan. Jackson and Kalira boarded the transport ship, leaving behind the stalwart, the Federation, and everything they had known. As they soared through the stars, the planet Riylo and the galaxy that had been torn apart by war faded into the distance. For the first time in a long while, Jackson allowed himself to believe in the possibility of peace, in the hope that perhaps, together, they could build something new. But as they moved further away from Federation space, Jackson knew that their fight was far from over. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But in that moment, as Kalira sat beside him, he realized that the future was theirs to shape. Together, they would stand against the odds. Together, they would rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt like he was truly fighting for something worth saving.